All right, well, going to get going. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. I suppose, first of all, a word concerning who I currently and usually happen to be. My name is Jason, and I'm a PhD candidate currently writing my thesis in the philosophy department here in Freiburg on psychedelic experiences. I am trying to figure out whether it is the case that people have similar kinds of experiences when they take one of the classic psychedelics. And I mean, that's a very varied and complicated question because psychedelic experiences are very varied and complicated. And I discovered that perhaps one of the most efficient ways of addressing the question is to study the way that people describe their experiences in terms of attention. Because I discovered that perhaps one of the most common things that people describe about their experiences is indeed things concerning attention. Things like I attended to more, or I had a heightened awareness, or things I usually didn't notice suddenly were foregrounded to me, things like that. And today what I want to talk to you about is an aspect of that research. Right, and I'm going to just start from a place of assuming no knowledge concerning what psychedelic experiences are, and speak about perhaps what anyone might have heard most commonly, certain phrases used to characterize psychedelics and psychedelic experiences, which I'll get to in a moment. First of all, what exactly are psychedelic experiences? Most basically, psychedelic experiences are induced by the intake of psychedelic substances, the classics. LSD, which you might know by the name acid. Psilocybin, you might be familiar with as being contained in magic mushrooms or magic truffles. Mescaline, which is a bit of an oldie, you might not be so familiar with that. And DMT, which you might be more familiar with in the form of ayahuasca, in which it's an active component. Now, psychedelics have been commonly called consciousness expanding drugs, and psychedelic experiences have been very commonly characterized as an expansion of consciousness. And why psychedelic experiences and psychedelics have been commonly characterized and described in these terms is because people often say that psychedelic experiences were experiences of so much more of the world or of their own bodies or their own self than is usually the case in their usual experiences, that they attended to so much more than they usually do. But until now, no one's really done a great deal, or any research really, as to what that phrase, expansion of consciousness, which is so common, actually refers to specifically as a general characterization, even the defining feature of psychedelic experiences. And what I'd like to propose is a quite specific answer, is that psychedelic expansion of consciousness refers to a series of highly unusual changes in the structure of experience that can be described in terms of extreme changes in attention. And if you're interested in looking at a more specific detailing of what I'm going to tell you today, what I'm telling you today is a kind of summary of a paper that I recently published with a professor at the university here, Susanne Schmetkamp. So you can look into that if you like. Okay, so before we get into what expansion of consciousness might be, first a word on how we're going to go about determining that. What we're going to do is we're going to take a phenomenological approach. Now, to put that quite simply, this means that we're only going to be interested in describing first-hand experiences, if you're interested in studying your own experiences with psychedelics. Or what we're going to be doing today is we're only going to be interested in looking at how people describe their first-hand experiences. What that means, negatively put, is not going to be looking at, on the one hand, psychometric questionnaires. That's sort of looking at quantitatively or statistically surveys of how people describe their experiences. So you might be looking at giving people preset questions, which according to which people are asked to rate certain aspects of their experiences. And then you would say, oh, well, 1,000 people rated on a scale of 1 to 7 that they experienced a level of 6, generally speaking, concerning ego dissolution when they took LSD. That doesn't tell you very much about whatever ego dissolution is. It just tells you that a lot of people had it. But if you want to really try and understand what's going on, you're going to need a lot more information about that. And we want that more information. And on the other hand, what we're not going to be interested in looking at is studies of neural activity, what happens in the brain when people take psychedelics. Now, it's perfectly legitimate to study how psychedelics affect the brain, if that's what you're interested in. But that's not what we're interested in now. We're interested in the experiences. You might say, well, if psychedelics affect neural activity, then if you want to explain the experiences, then you have to study the neural activity. Well, that's quite a highly questionable position to have in the sense of reducing experience to neural activity. You can either suspend the question and say, well, we can just study the experiences and explain and describe a lot about the experiences, and we don't have to look at the neural activity. Or you can take a lot of a stronger position and just say the taking of the psychedelic is an event that occurs, and that may or may not have anything to do with neural activity. In either case, to understand the experiences means actually studying the experiences and not the neural activity in question. But that being said, if you want to study neural activity, study neural activity. If you want to study the experiences, study the experiences. At least that's the phenomenological position. Okay, now the second step, if we want to understand what expansion of consciousness is, why people are using that phrase and what they're referring to, we want to look for the common features in how people describe their first-hand psychedelic experiences. Of course, we want to look to for the common features that pertain to expansion of consciousness. What are people referring to? And is it the case that they're all referring to the same thing? What does this phrase actually mean? Okay, so how we can go about this is going to go about a survey of a lot of trip reports, so to speak. If you want to be formal, you can call them subject reports. We're going to organize these first-hand descriptions of psychedelic experiences into 3 broad categories concerning expansion of consciousness. Call them world expansion, bodily expansion, expansion of subjectivity. To talk about the category of world expansion, we just mean whatever a subject experiences as distinct from themselves, existing out there in the world, not them. Bodily expansion, some kind of expansion in their own body. And if we talk about expansion of subjectivity, some sort of experience of more concerning things that relate to themselves or how they experience the world. But we'll detail them as we go through the categories respectively. Okay, start with world expansion. As mentioned, these are changes in the scope and quality of whatever the subject experiences as existing in the world as distinct from themselves. But as we'll get into in this category, this distinction between you and the world is something that can not only get blurry but dissolve entirely during psychedelic experiences. And that's part of this sense of expansion that characterizes them. Okay, the first respect in which there can be the sense of more, the sense of expansion that's very commonly described by people during their psychedelic experiences is that what is usually present in experience, so what is usually part of your everyday life, what you usually experience, seems to be far more rich or vivid than usual. So here's a description from an LSD experience. Sensations were acute. I heard, saw, felt, smelled, and tasted more fully than ever before or since. What I had experienced was essentially, with few exceptions, the usual content of experience, but that of everything there was more. This more was what I think must be meant by the expansion of consciousness. Second, what is usually unnoticed or underappreciated is instead foregrounded. Here's a quote from Aldous Huxley from a very famous mescaline experience that he wrote about. "Those folds in the trousers, what a labyrinth of endlessly significant complexity, and the texture of the grey flannel, how rich, how deeply, mysteriously sumptuous." And then thirdly, and concerning this, what is usually unnoticed or unappreciated is instead becoming intensely foregrounded. It might be the folds in the trousers that are suddenly capturing someone's attention dramatically. It might be, as people describe, suddenly the cracks on the wall or the steam arising from a cup of tea. It really could be anything. All those little details in the world that are always there but are just sort of in the background, so to speak. Suddenly they boom, a whole world to be explored. Right. Then third, when it's focused on, a single thing or phenomenon expands dramatically in the richness or complexity of its features. So usually it's just something vaguely in the background, don't really pay any attention to it, so to speak. Now suddenly it's there, and it's there in so much complexity. Here's a quote from another cult text in psychedelia, from Alan Watts and from an LSD experience. And I'm using these two examples because these are two examples from trip reports that give very brief theories concerning expansion of consciousness, which I'll have a word on if we have time later. Right, so this one. "The depth of light and structure in a bursting bud go on forever. There is time to see them, time for the whole intricacy of veins and capillaries to develop in consciousness, time to see down and down into the shape of greenness, which is not green at all, but a whole spectrum generalizing itself as green, purple, gold, the sunlit turquoise of the ocean, the intense luminescence of the emerald." And then fourthly, there might not just be the case that what is usually there is experienced with more detail, that what is usually unnoticed is suddenly foregrounded, but there might be the sense of you're experiencing more because you're experiencing some kind of novel phenomena. This might be in the case of synesthesia, which is that your various senses begin to merge. You might, for instance, taste colors. And there might also be the hallucination of very complex geometric patterns. And I found this very interesting quote from a text by a German psychologist in which he tried to give a sort of mapping out of all the various types of geometric hallucinations you might have if you're tripping on mescaline. Very interesting text. But this quote is interesting because what's described is not just a hallucination of a geometric pattern, but that this geometric pattern becomes blended with the experience of one's own body. So it's quite an interesting one. And it goes, "In the diffusely illuminated visual field, a luminous spiral forms itself through the active movement of a stripe. This quickly rotating spiral is moving back and forth in the field. At the same time, one of my legs assumes spiral form. The luminous spiral and the haptic spiral blends psychologically. That is to say, the same spiral which is optically hallucinated is also haptically experienced. In a hallucinatory way, the leg blends haptically with the luminous spiral." And then it may also be the case that time and space are experienced as being expanded. In a book in which he describes both his own quite extensive experiences with ayahuasca and his interviews with thousands of subjects concerning their ayahuasca experiences, Shannon describes Benny Shannon describes one of his own ayahuasca experiences. He says, "When my eyes were closed and I was hallucinating, time seemed to be an eternity and I was frightened. I opened my eyes and watching the clock on the wall, I realized that only 2 minutes had elapsed." And then the famous phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, describing one mescaline experience he had, says, "The walls of the room are 150 meters from each other, and above them there is a vast and deserted expanse. The extended hand is as high as the wall." Right. So these are all the various ways in which the term expansion of consciousness might refer to the way in which the world is experienced as expanded. And now we can move on to how the body might be experienced as expanded. First, there might be some kind of heightened awareness of the body in the sense that typically unnoticed aspects are foregrounded. Here's a quote from an LSD experience from a very interesting website called Erowid.com. It's sort of an online repository of self-reports which anyone can upload to. It goes, "I looked at my hands. They were no longer flesh-colored, but rather had a pattern of alternating magenta and green stripes, or a sort of web-like design. I suspect I was picking up on the network of blood vessels beneath my skin. They were also slightly metallic and shimmered in the sunlight." Second, and I hinted to this earlier, there might be a dissolution of boundaries between body and world. That's experienced as an expansion of the body, because if those boundaries dissolve, one's body is then experienced as expanding into the world, so to speak. An LSD experience here again, after the first awareness of tactile strangeness, there comes a dilation of the sensory frontiers. For example, one feels as though one were part of the chair and floor. There is no lightness or dizziness, but on the contrary, a strong sensation of massivity, as though one were part of an immensely powerful living structure. Right. So these are the two main senses in which there might be an experience of an expanded body that I've identified, commonly in subject reports. Then we can move on to a sense of an expansion of subjectivity, in the sense, first, of self-related phenomena. First, there might be an expansion of emotional intensity and range, as well as of memories. Here's a nice quote that captures these aspects. LSD experience. "I was reliving childhood experiences of which I had scarcely any conscious knowledge. Until today, I had remembered only isolated fragments, but now the entire sequence reeled off as from a microfilm that was surely stored within my head. This reliving was very painful, and I could see that in bearing it, my life had been altered. One of the fabulous aspects of this microfilm was the clarity of color and form, from the facial expressions to the most minute details of the background." Of course, something like that would be of interest to people working in psychedelic therapy. Okay, then a second sense concerning expansion of consciousness. There might be this sense of expanded imagination, both in the sense of closed-eyed visions of very abstract patterns, as well as this sense of being immersed in bizarrely intricate worlds. From a mescaline experience, shifting colors and forms danced upon my closed eyelids. Some of these were patterns of great intricacy, such as those which embellish certain parts of sacred buildings, mosques, temples, and so on, or sacred objects of various kinds. And here's an odd one. DMT, I have found, has many common features with the other classic psychedelics, but can be quite an outlier in terms of some of the odd so-called entity encounters that occur. But here's one concerning entities and the world that one engages with. They were trying to show me as much as possible. They were communicating in words. They were like clowns or jokers or imps. There were just so many of them doing their funny little thing. I settled into it. I was incredibly still and felt like I was in an incredibly peaceful place. And here's, I think, quite a nice artistic rendition of this expanded imaginative world that one can be in with one's eyes closed. From Alex Gray. Yeah. Okay. And then to the last sense in which there might be an expansion of subjectivity that is commonly reported, there's an increased scope and degree of attention that is very frequently reported. So reports abound with these phrases like supernormally clear focus of attention, extraordinary intensity of attention, heightened awareness, and immense concentration. And in these senses, subjects describe being captivated, as I've mentioned a few times now, by minute and usually considered mundane phenomena. For instance, LSD experience, each object that I looked at held my fascinated attention. I felt I had never really seen this garden before. I was enchanted with each plant, leaf, flower, tree trunk, and the earth itself. Each blade of grass stood that's a bit of a mess, separate and distinct, edged with light. Each was supremely important. And these states of such deep and sustained attention to usually unnoticed details, I have found, entail losing awareness of the surrounding world, time and space embodiment, and even oneself. And here's another quote from that famous little book on mescaline by Aldous Huxley. Quite like this one. The legs, for example, of that chair, how miraculous their tubularity, how supernatural their polished smoothness. I spent several minutes, or was it several centuries, not merely gazing at those bamboo legs, but actually being them, or rather being myself in them. Or to be still more accurate, for I was not involved in the case, nor in a certain sense were they, being my not-self in the not-self, which was the chair. And what's being described here is this sense of oneness with the universe, which is often part of ego dissolution. So there's this progression where you become so deeply attentive to something, whatever it is, very often this thing you don't usually notice, very specific, the tubularity, the shape of a chair leg, which is always there, chair legs are always there. You become so deeply obsessed with a chair leg that you even, so to speak, forget that you exist. And this forgetting that you exist brings about this feeling that you have expanded, or now that you are included in the whole expanse of the universe, or included in being the chair. But I will describe this in a moment. So, what I've done so far is gone through all the possible senses in which there might be expansion of consciousness. And I've just given some sort of very vivid key quotes from some trip reports. But these are very much the most common features through all the trip reports that I've studied in which we could talk about expansion of consciousness. So now the question is there any way in which, there's quite a variety of things, crazy things that are happening. Is there any way in which we can sort of thread them together to form a more cohesive picture, perhaps? And we'll see that now in trying to give a kind of analysis of it. And I think that we can do that to give a sort of general sense of what people commonly mean when they talk about expansion of consciousness across these various categories. We can do that, I think, by adapting the work of the phenomenologist Aaron Gurvich. And let's just give an overview of that work that we can apply. So firstly, we can think about experiences generally being structured into 3 dimensions. And to talk about experience having this basic structure is to talk about the way in which phenomena are basically related. And if I talk about phenomena, just to give a very basic definition, it's just phenomena is whatever you experience. That could be objects in the world. It could be your thoughts, your feelings, an itch in your leg, whatever else. Right. So these 3 dimensions. First, we can describe the theme. That's whatever is most prominent in your experience. Commonly, we might call that the focus of your attention, or the center of attention, or the foreground. These are all common words to describe what we'll just summarize as the theme. Okay. To say that something is most prominent in experience is that's the thing which is most distinct, right? It has the most vivid structure, it has the greatest range of features, the most complexity. It's quite intuitive, I think, to everyone what is the most prominent thing in your experience right now. Then the context is whatever is less or secondarily prominent in experience. Why? That's because it's relevant to the theme. Okay, so to think of an example, let's see. If my voice is currently the theme, if you're not distracted or bored, for instance, then because if my voice is the theme and I'm speaking about the topic right now, then precisely the topic is and what I've said before is all part of the context, the talk, your thoughts about what I just said before. These are all relevant to my voice and what I'm saying right now. The margin is what is least prominent in experience because it's irrelevant to the theme. What's irrelevant to the theme? Well, that might just be vague street noises in the back, the marks on the wall, shadows, so on and so forth. Maybe the feeling of your clothes on your leg, so on and so forth. Okay. Right. Now just a word, So I mentioned phenomena, it's just whatever you happen to experience. That should not be thought of just as objects in the world, physical things. That could be anything at all, memories, feelings, so on and so forth. And phenomena are not just these homogeneous wholes, they're structures of features. What that means is that they have many features, and these many features have relations to one another. What that means is that some of these features are more or less prominent, and those features which are most prominent characterize the phenomenon as a whole. So, for instance, maybe if we take a chair as an example, I know why chairs are always such classic examples in philosophy. I always like to think about chairs. Anyway, for instance, the most prominent features of a chair are the back of the chair and its legs. That's quite characteristic of being a chair. But the chair has many other features, right? Its color, it's the scratches, but these are all things that are not very prominent, but they're still there. They're just less prominent. So phenomena has many features, some are more or less prominent. The most prominent of those features characterize it and make it recognizable as that kind of phenomenon, a chair. Okay. So these are just all some preliminary definitions that'll help us to understand expansion of consciousness, I promise. Okay, so now just to put them all together in our last two boring philosophical definitions, and then we can get back to tripping balls on all sorts of strange substances. Structure of experience is the presence and relation between the phenomena that constitute experience. That just means what is experienced and the relationship between that which is experienced. Some things are more prominent, more in the foreground. Some things are less prominent, more in the background. And some things least of all prominent in the margins. You barely experience them at all, but they're still there. Right. What's attention? I think attention is this term that we all use to describe the relations between the phenomena in our experience, as well as the features of those phenomena and how they change in terms of how relevant and prominent they are in relation to one another. So if I say, pay attention, I'm saying, can you please make my voice like the most prominent thing in your experience, or have that be the case? And if I'm saying, thank you for your attention, I'm saying thank you for having this be the theme of your attention, and so forth. We're just talking about our experience in a certain way. Right. Okay. Now, trying to make sense of psychedelic expansion of consciousness. I think that attentional transformations, so changes in attention, describe certain changes to the structure of experience and the structure of phenomena. And that psychedelic expansion of consciousness can generally be described in terms of certain extreme attentional transformations in the structure of experience. And now we can start breaking things down more plainly. First way we can understand psychedelic expansion of consciousness is in terms of an attentional enlargement of context. This is when more phenomena than usual become relevant to a theme. In other words, the context is enlarged. That might be in common language when someone says, I suddenly had a heightened awareness of my surroundings, or I gained a broader perspective on a problem, or something like that. You had a very narrow view of something, and then all of a sudden you realize so much is relevant to it. Now in psychedelic experiences, what happens is that usually unnoticed or underappreciated things become far more prominent, leading to the sense that more of the world is being experienced. So you're looking at one thing, and suddenly so much more things around it become relevant to it, and you have the sense that the world is becoming wider, right? Now, when you're looking at this one thing, and the whole world around it is becoming wider, and sort of has a sense that everything is filling out, whatever it is that is the theme, well, the world is filling out around it, and that thing starts to appear quite strange or unreal or absurd. And why is that? Because it's appearing in quite a different context. Because things look a certain way in certain contexts. To use an odd example maybe, if you have a teacup on a kitchen table, it's quite normal. It looks quite normal. Teacups look normal on kitchen tables. If you put a teacup on the head of an elephant, it looks quite weird, because that's not usually where teacups are. And this is what happens when things look, in one sense, quite strange in psychedelic experiences. You're looking at a normal thing. We'll use our chair example again. But now you're noticing, like you don't usually, everything else that's usually always around it, but suddenly is far more prominent, and you're like, whoa, that chair looks weird, because it's in a whole new context. Of course, there are other things that are happening. That chair might be moving and doing all sorts of other weird things. That's another thing to be explained that we won't go into. But this is part of why things you look at appear very weird, because they appear in a different context. Okay. So that's one sense in which there's expansion of consciousness. There's this enlargement of context. Then there's this another sense. We can call it attentional elucidation of context or clarification. The relevance of phenomena to the theme becomes clearer. They thus become more prominent, and they become available as more potential themes. So in psychedelic experiences, what this means is it describes becoming conscious of more heightened detail and complexity in phenomena that are usually unnoticed or underappreciated. So to put it in other words, what this means is that when so many usually unnoticed or underappreciated things in the world suddenly become more prominent as you're looking at some other thing, because they've now become more relevant, where usually not that much is relevant to something, they become available to you as more things to look at, whereas usually you wouldn't look at them at all. And they become more available as more things to look at, because they appear with a greater sort of complexity and vividness of features. It's almost like I don't know if some of you are familiar with the philosopher Walter Benjamin, but he once had a mescaline experience, and during this he spoke about feeling like a child. And many people speak about feeling very childlike during their experiences, which I find quite interesting. And I think why they describe this is because what a child does is they're always interested in exploring the next thing. They have this sense of curiosity because they have all these many potential themes or things to next be interested in. And I think this is what is being described here. There are many things that appear with an unusual kind of vividness and complexity that are next potentially the things to be the focus of attention. Right. Now, just as an aside, and as a general description, bad trips on a surface can be described as being kind of overwhelmed by this, as a sort of experience of too much. And then sometimes you can, what makes that worse is then trying to reinstate of the usual structure of experience, or to have it not be the case, what's occurring. But yeah, I won't speak about that here, just a note. Okay. Not only is there expansion of consciousness, there's something that should also be mentioned. There can also be an interesting contraction of consciousness, or narrowing. There might be an attentional contraction of consciousness. This is when fewer phenomena are relevant to the theme. In psychedelic experiences, this can be extreme in the sense that people describe having such intense focus to something that it expands to there being all that one is conscious of. So that they can say, like, if you remember the Huxley example, it's like, oh, I looked at the chair leg and then there was nothing. The chair leg was the whole universe. Or people might say, I was looking at the patterns on a table and then that was it. That's all that there was. So yeah. Now that's an important thing to keep in mind, because on the one hand, there's this contraction to one thing. And then you might say, well, that's the opposite of expansion of consciousness. But there's this interesting interplay that happens where there's contraction to one thing, but then the one thing expands into a whole universe of features, or becomes what people describe a world in itself. But we'll get to that in a moment. That's the moment is now. That snuck up on me. Okay, so subjects commonly report, upon this intense attentional contraction to some theme, an explosive proliferation and transformation of its features. And then they say something like worlds within worlds have been explored. And this is sometimes, and can be compared to, I don't know if you've ever seen videos of this on YouTube, for instance, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, a Mandelbrot fractal zoom. I don't know if that rings any bells, but I'll show a video in a moment, because it illustrates it better than I think I'm capable of describing. But before the video, here's some descriptions of it. Ever more complex variations upon a theme. Ferns sprouting ferns in multi-dimensional spaces. Vast kaleidoscopic domes of stained glass or mosaic. Or patterns like the models of highly intricate molecules. Systems of colored balls, each one of which turns out to be a multitude of smaller balls, forever and ever. And another, I fell deeper and deeper into the visual experience. The visuals were more powerful than I've ever known. It felt as if I was speeding through a tunnel of fractals, like zooming through a Mandelbrot set. Right, and here is the example I wish to show you, if I can get it to work. So here we go. Okay, so this is quite an interesting feature. So, and quite difficult to describe. But what I think is occurring here is what might be described as a very extreme case of attentional restructuration of the theme. So most basically, before we get to the extreme case illustrated by what I just showed you, is a change of which features are more or less prominent and characterize the theme as a whole. So first, now that I used the chair example, we're stuck on the chair example as our basic example. You might first have the usual relations of prominence with the chair. You experience the chair. Generally, the most prominent is the general shape of the chair and the back and the legs. It's chair, right? But then there might be this restructuration happens, and actually what then becomes more prominent is things like the shades of color or the scratches, right? Now, what happens in psychedelic experiences that's more extreme is there might be a continual restructuring of the theme's features, whatever you focused on, so that whatever the usually unnoticed or underappreciated, less prominent features of the themes are, might, so to speak, come to the foreground. And each time that they come to the foreground, they appear with more detail. And then whenever they appear with more detail, then those more details appear with more details. That point, and that can just go on endlessly, as you saw in the illustration in the video. So whenever there's a focused point, that focused point, so to speak, zoomed in on, then becomes another spectrum of features, and any one of those spectrum of features becomes a spectrum of features. And that's what people describe as this sort of bottomless worlds within worlds experience. That's quite interesting. And I think that can be described as an extreme restructuration of the theme, this feeling that the world can just be, or whatever it is that you're experiencing, the world, the body, yourself, can just be this bottomless expansion of complexity and novelty. Yeah. Okay. Then to our last sense of ways in which consciousness might be considered expanded. There's this sense in which an enlargement and elucidation of context, that implies or entails that usually marginal phenomena shift nearer to the center of attention. So what that means is, what are usually marginal phenomena? So things that, as I mentioned, you usually don't notice or appreciate. That might be like aspects of your body you don't usually notice, the back of your hand, so to speak, or certain features of your face, or parts of the world, maybe that picture on the wall in your house you always notice. It's just part of the furniture, or that blends into the background. People sometimes use the phrase, or aspects of the city you always walk past or don't notice. These things, as there's an enlargement and elucidation of context, they're usually on the margin, but now they shift closer to the center of attention, so to speak. And that shift means they're becoming more prominent. They become more clearer and more distinct. That means that they appear with, as I mentioned, unusual prominence in consciousness when they're usually obscure. And then they might become themes themselves. They have more greater potential to become the focus of attention. That's what happens in psychedelic experiences to an extreme extent. These things you usually only experience marginally suddenly can become the focus of attention. Yes, and if they become, the focus of attention, they might appear very strangely. To give you an everyday analogy, I don't know if you've looked at your face in the mirror for very long, but the longer you look at it, the weirder it begins to look, right? This is what happens to an extreme degree on psychedelics. You begin to look at things for a long time, and very intensely. And then there might be these experiences of existential strangeness or derealization or depersonalization. Things might seem the most normal things in the world might seem absolutely alien, or not even real, or what I like to call the Macbeth effect. Sometimes people might hold their hand in front of their face and it might feel like not their hand anymore. Yeah. Okay, now there might also, the inverse to the expansion effect, there might be when there's this attentional contraction to the theme, becoming so focused on something that you lose awareness of other things. That might also entail a contraction of the margin. Now, things that are usually part of the margin are things like this sort of minimal self-awareness, that you might be in the background somewhat aware that you are undergoing experience in some sense, that you have some kind of bodily awareness and some broad awareness of where you are in the world, and that you are in a world or a space, a city, a room, extend that as far as you like. Now, when you become so, as I've described, deeply attentive to some thing, no matter how mundane, it might be the legs of a chair, the crack on a wall, doesn't matter. And when these worlds become worlds, that's when people describe these experiences of losing all sense of themselves, losing any sense of having a body, of having any awareness of time and space. And that we can describe as this contraction of the margin. And that follows from this attentional contraction to the theme, becoming so deeply focused on anything, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be something in the world, a petal of a flower, it could be a feeling, it could be a memory, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be anything at all. Okay, now finally, this is quite interesting. There might be expansion generally in the sense of what you could call attentional synthesizing. That's when a theme merges as a feature of a phenomenon or as a feature of the whole field of consciousness, which is now the new theme. In psychedelic experiences, this is quite extreme in the sense with someone might feel that they, as a whole or part of their body, merges with whatever the theme is, or all that there is consciousness of. So they might be sitting on a chair and suddenly they feel that their body is part of the chair. Or they might feel that they have become part of everything that they experience. And then sometimes people use the phrase of a sense of oneness with the universe or oceanic boundlessness. So then there's this expansion of consciousness in the sense that one feels that one is everything in some sense. Yeah. So that is the, I think, final and to some degree most dramatic sense in which people describe expansion of consciousness. Okay. Now I suppose the final big question people might think is, do you really experience more during psychedelic experiences? I don't think the question makes any sense, because I don't think experiences can be quantified as being more or less. What does it really mean to experience more or less of something? Can you actually quantify that? I don't think so. You have to ask the question, is the stuff of experience numerically calculable? Doesn't make any sense. Unless you have a view of whatever it is that we're experiencing as being some kind of, you might say, information or data, which I don't think is a tenable position to have. That's sort of applying a view that we might have of physical matter to our own experience, which is problematic. However, I do think that we can say that experiences are differently structured, and in that way experiences can be very different in the ways I've described. Psychedelic experiences are highly unusual in their structure. We experience things in different ways that we definitely usually don't. And they might include novel phenomena and events. Things that usually don't happen are happening, and we might have combinations of phenomena that we usually don't. You usually don't experience your body as part of a chair. You usually don't have such intense experiences of synesthesia where you're not only hallucinating complex geometric patterns, but your leg is also the complex geometric pattern that you're hallucinating. Yeah, so they're very different, yes. But the question of an experience being more or less perhaps is not the right way of speaking about it, I think. So yeah, I think that is all I have to say. And I'll just leave the references up here if you are interested in reading more context of any of the quotes I've used, for instance. And yes, so thank you very much for listening, and happy to have questions and discussion and whatever else. Yeah.